This God is different than others I've heard men speak of. I believe him. He said that through me, all the earth will be blessed. He said he would lead us. We will follow. I have been faithful to you, O God. I have crossed the land on your account. Moved my family. Risked my life. I hold nothing from you. Even my only son.
You may think I'm a little strange for this, but I'm fascinated by people who have humorous epitaphs on their tombstone. All the following epitaphs that I'm about to share with you are real. For instance, one says, "Here lays Butch. We planted him raw. He was quick on the trigger, but slow on the draw." That from Silver City, Nevada. Or how about this one, Anna Wallace? "The children of Israel wanted bread, and the Lord sent them manna. Old Clerk Wallace wanted a wife, and the devil sent him Anna." That one comes out of Ribsford, England. Margaret Daniels. "She always said her feet were killing her, but nobody believed her," from Richmond, Virginia. Anna Hopewell. "Here lies the body of our Anna, done to death by a banana. It wasn't the fruit that laid her low, but the skin of the thing that made her go." And that's from Innisburg's Fall, Vermont. And then this one out of Albany, New York. Harry Edsel Smith, born 1903, died 1942, looked up the elevator shaft to see if the car was on the way down. It was. And then one more in memory of Beza Wood from Winslow, Maine. "Here lies one wood enclosed in wood, one wood within another. The outer wood is very good. We cannot praise the other." And as humorous as that is, it's actually very sad to think that someone could come to the end of their life and not have others be able to say anything good about her. Hebrews chapter 11 could be viewed as a collection of epitaphs of people who died. The chapter begins with these words, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for." And I like how the New Century Version translates verse 2. It says, "Faith is the reason we remember great people who lived in the past." And that's true, isn't it? Every single person in the Bible we regard as great was a man or woman of faith. That faith made a difference in the way they lived, in the way they responded to God. That's why we remember them, because it's easy to say we believe, but faith is not an easy thing to put into practice. We started talking about faith last week, and for the benefit of those who maybe weren't able to see or listen to last week's sermon, let me just give you a quick overview of what was said. We began by talking about what faith is, and I said that perhaps the best word to sum up biblical faith is the word trust. But there are different levels of trust. We can trust someone a lot, or we can trust them not very much at all. And so as Christians, although we have faith, we often wonder, do I have faith enough? Is my faith as strong as it ought to be? We saw the Bible character whose faith is held up for us as a model more often than any other, and that's Abraham. And so we began looking at Abraham's early life in the city of Ur with his family, worshiping heathen gods, and how God called him out of Ur and later out of Haran. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you." And we talked about the great amount of faith that it would take to leave your family and your home and to leave without even knowing your destination. And while there was some wavering on Abraham's part in those early years, he still exhibited a tremendous amount of faith. And yet at this early stage, Abraham did not yet have a faith that was credited to him for righteousness. Now, I said we would find out when that was in this morning's message, and you may be somewhat surprised to find out when Abraham's faith reached that point. If you think it was at the offering of Isaac, you're wrong. We'll find out when it was in just a few minutes. But let's pick up first in Genesis chapter 13. After Abraham and Lot separated from one another, God renewed his promise to one day renewed his promise to Abraham when he said that all the land of Abraham, all that he could see, would one day belong to his descendants, and that his descendants would be as numerous as the dust on the earth, too many to count, which is an amazing promise to a man who doesn't yet have any children. And then in chapter 15, God appears to Abraham in a vision. Now, by this time, Abraham was beginning to have some serious doubts about Sarah bearing him a son. He knew that if he didn't have a son, God couldn't give him anything that he had promised. And so Abraham came to God with an alternative solution, and he requested that God accept his servant Eliezer as his heir. He could be like an adopted son, Abraham thought. But God rejected that proposal, and he said in verse 4, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." And once again, God declared that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the heavens. Now, when God said that, Abraham believed God's promise. And it was at that point that his faith was credited to him for righteousness. Verse 6 reads, "And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." Now, you may wonder, what it is that's significant about this particular point in time. And so I want you to notice that it was only when Abraham trusted God's promise in the face of his own doubts that God credited Abraham's faith for righteousness. And it's important for us to notice that, that physically nothing had changed at this point. Sarah was barren in Ur. She was barren in Haran. She was barren when she arrived in Canaan. And she was still barren at this time. Nothing physically indicated that she had been given the ability to conceive. God simply said that a son was going to be born. And on nothing more than the promise of God, Abraham believed it would happen. He believed that God would keep his promise simply because God said that he would. He trusted God to keep his promise at a time when Abraham had genuine doubts. And that is the faith which God credits for righteousness. There was still a lot that Abraham and Sarah didn't understand. And after some years went by and a child still wasn't born, they continued to have their doubts. In fact, you may recall that Sarah came up with her own alternative plan. She decided to give Abraham her handmaid, Hagar. Hagar could conceive a child on Sarah's behalf, a surrogate child. And that child could then be regarded as Sarah's, and he would be considered their heir. And so Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old. But 13 years later, at the age of 99, Abraham received word from God that Ishmael was not the promised son. And once again, in Genesis chapter 17, God renewed his promise. God would give Abraham many descendants, and God would make Abraham the father of a multitude of nations. Then Abraham was told to seal this covenant with God with a very specific act. Every male in his house was to be circumcised. From this point on, circumcision would stand as a sign of the covenant between Abraham and God. Now, the reaction of Abraham was this. In verse 17, he falls on his face and he laughs. Abraham wanted to know, how could I become a father at the age of 100, he thought? And how can Sarah have a baby when she's 90 years old? And then Abraham begged God to accept Ishmael as his heir. And I want you to see what a struggle this was for Abraham. I want you to see the doubt that he felt in his heart. From Abraham's perspective, there seemed to be absolutely no way for God to keep his promise. And yet God's reply was clear. Ishmael would not be the heir. Another son named Isaac would be born of Sarah. In fact, Sarah would give birth to Isaac at the same time in 1 year later. Now, I want you to notice the kind of faith which God counts for righteousness. When God stopped talking with Abraham, Abraham immediately circumcised Ishmael, every male under his authority, and he had himself circumcised. And he did that because he had absolute confidence that God would keep his promise. What had changed? Nothing. Was Sarah pregnant? Nope. And she wouldn't be for another 3 months. What tangible evidence did Abraham have that God would do what he said he would do? Absolutely none. But in the midst of those uncertainties, Abraham trusted God. Based on God's promise and nothing more, Abraham circumcised himself and every male under his oversight. This was a terribly painful thing for Abraham to do. But Abraham did it to keep his part of the covenant. He did it because he believed that God would keep his promise. And that's the kind of faith that made Abraham righteous before God. Abraham was obedient, but it was not the obedience of being circumcised that made him righteous. It was his faith, a faith which prompted the circumcision. It was that faith that made him righteous. And 1 year later, Abraham and Sarah were the proud parents of a baby boy named Isaac. And things were starting to look up. God had kept his promise exactly like he said he would. And after having a child at the age of 100, you would think that Abraham would never struggle with a doubt again. But you'd be wrong. Because once again, God spoke to Abraham. This time it was a short message with no explanation. He said, "Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you." And though we've heard this story many times, we still find it incredible that God would demand this of Abraham. You know, there are few things in this life more painful than the sorrow of losing a child. To any parent, that alone would be an unspeakable tragedy. Nothing in all the world seems more unnatural than for parents to bury their children. But this took it one step further. God told Abraham to offer his own son. And there are a lot of ways, really a couple of ways, that Abraham could have reacted to that command. First, he could have doubted that it was God who was speaking to him. I mean, after all, God had never before required human sacrifice, and the very command seemed to be out of character with God. And then, number two, he could have ignored the command because it didn't make any sense. It just seemed to go against what God had promised in Ur and in Haran and in Canaan. It seemed to violate the very covenant that God had made with Abraham. God had promised Abraham a son, and God specifically said that Isaac was that promised son. God made it very clear that Isaac was the one through whom all these descendants were to come. It was his descendants who were to possess the land of Canaan. It was his descendants through whom the blessing was to come for all the earth. Without Isaac, none of that could happen. And Abraham could have refused to obey simply on the basis that it just didn't make any sense. You see, Abraham didn't know how God could keep his promise if Isaac was dead. He just knew that God would do it somehow. And that's an important lesson for all of us. When God makes a promise, we don't need to wonder how He will keep His word. Faith will trust God and leave the how in the hands of Almighty God. You know, if we try to figure out how God will take care of us, we'll end up doing things our way and not God's way. And so Abraham rose up early the next morning. He saddled a donkey for himself. He selected 2 young men to accompany him, to assist him on the journey. He cut the wood for the sacrifice. He took the wood and the fire with him. And when he neared the place of offering, he ordered the young servants to stay behind, probably to make sure that no one would interfere with what he was about to do. The entire situation is almost too painful to imagine, really. I mean, here was a man over 100 years old with his son whose birth he had looked forward to for decades. He loved Isaac more than he loved his own life. Isaac represented all of the hopes and all of the dreams of Abraham's future. And for 3 days, Abraham traveled with his son, knowing that every step took them closer to Isaac's death. For 3 days, he watched and he listened to the son he loved, knowing that these were the last days that he would ever see him. And if the journey was difficult, think about how painful those final moments must have been. When they reached the mountain, Abraham had Isaac carry the wood for his own sacrifice, while Abraham carried the knife and the fire. And it's hard to see how Abraham could even speak to answer when Isaac asked him, "Father, where's the lamb for the sacrifice?" I mean, imagine the emotions of Abraham, the emotions that he must have experienced as they built the altar and they laid the wood on it. I mean, what kind of faith is it which would move a man to tie up the son that he loves more than life itself and to place that son helplessly on the altar and to look at that son's face as he raises the knife to end the boy's life? I mean, what kind of faith would do such a thing? Well, the answer is a faith which believed that God, regardless of the circumstances, would keep His promises. A faith which believed that even Isaac's death could not stop God from keeping His covenant. A faith which trusted God so much that it would obey God even when God's request couldn't be understood. That was the faith that God reckoned for righteousness. But of course, the angel stopped Abraham. So what was the point? I mean, why did God tell Abraham to do it to begin with? You know, we sometimes say, well, it was a test of Abraham's faith. And I think that's true. But Abraham had already proven his faith in God in many other ways. I mean, he'd left Ur and he'd left Haran. He left his family. He wandered in Canaan. He built altars and he had trusted God to give him an heir. I mean, what need was there for any further proof? I mean, what specifically did God hope to accomplish by this test? Well, I think that God wanted I think what God wanted to test was this. Did Abraham place his faith in the fact that Isaac was alive? Or did Abraham place his faith in the God who gave him Isaac? Now, I want that to sink in for a moment, if you will. Because if we're not careful, we can put our trust in the things which God has given us rather than trusting the God who gave us those things. I mean, after the birth of Isaac, it was easy for Abraham to trust God. He had a son. But God wanted to know if Isaac was gone, would Abraham's trust in God continue? Or was Abraham's confidence in God now limited to Isaac's life and well-being? And there was only one way to find out. It's a question that I think we all need to ask ourselves. Is our faith in God, or is our faith in the things which God has given us? For example, we trust that God will provide for our needs. And it's easy to trust that if you have a job. But is your trust in God, or is your trust in the job which God has given you? Or to put it another way, if your job was taken away from you, would you still trust that God would take care of you? Could you still trust in God if your health was taken away? Or what if someone you dearly love passes away? My point is that it's easy to trust God when everything's going great. But if everything we have is taken away from us, would we still be able to trust that God would take care of us and that everything will be all right? And if we can't trust God in those circumstances, then maybe our trust isn't really in God. Maybe it's in the things or the people that God has given us. But Abraham proved that his life was ruled by absolute confidence in God. God was the one that Abraham trusted, the God who gave him Isaac. And that same God would keep his promises even if Isaac died. Abraham didn't understand how. He didn't have a clue, but he knew that God would keep his word. The Hebrew writer put it this way: it was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. It was because of that kind of faith that God regarded Abraham as a righteous man. Now, Abraham was a man of obedience, leaving Ur and Haran and wandering as a foreigner in the land of Canaan for many years. And his willingness to sacrifice Isaac rank among the greatest acts of obedience of all time. And yet, it is the faith of Abraham which is held up to us as an example. It's significant that a man of great obedience would be our example of faith, because there is not and never has been a conflict between those two things. Obedience and faith are so connected that either one is meaningless without the other. As James 2 verse 22 says, you see, his faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. As I said earlier, Abraham was obedient, but it was not his obedience that made him righteous. It was his faith, the faith which prompted the obedience, which made him righteous. It's a subtle distinction, I know, but it's an important one. What does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Biblical faith doesn't negate the importance of obedience. In fact, it produces a superior form of obedience. When Abraham obeyed God in offering Isaac, he acted promptly, and he did exactly what God instructed him to do. And there can be no higher level of obedience that Abraham demonstrated on that occasion. He was able to obey to that extent because of his faith in God's promises. Faith allows us to completely trust in God's ability to keep His promises. And faith then compels us to obey God promptly and completely. But Abraham shows us that even a strong faith is not characterized by perfect obedience. I mean, as obedient as Abraham was, he still made mistakes. After having enough faith to leave Haran, Abraham didn't trust God enough to keep him safe in Egypt. And so he lied about Sarah, his wife. And then he laughed at the thought of Sarah having a child. And then Abraham lied again, this time to King Abimelech. It's significant that even after Abraham had the faith which God counted for righteousness, he still let God down from time to time. And so obviously, having a strong faith does not mean obeying perfectly. And the faith which God credits for righteousness is not characterized by never having any doubts. In fact, Abraham first attained that level of faith at a time when doubt moved him to ask God to accept Eliezer as his heir. And long after Abraham had developed that faith, he experienced his most severe doubts, laughing at the idea of having a child and declaring in his heart that it was impossible. Having a faith which God credits for righteousness doesn't mean never having any doubts. And so the question for us as Christians is not, do we ever have doubts? The question is, when we have doubts, do we still trust the fact that God will keep His word? The trust that God saw in Abraham is the highest level of trust that we're capable of having. It's the kind of trust which exists when a person will accept and act on God's promises simply because God has given His assurance. Hebrews 11:6 says, "And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to Him must believe that God exists and that He rewards those who sincerely seek Him." And I think it's the case that this kind of faith cannot exist in a person's life until he comes to a time in his life that demands that he trusts God and not himself. I mean, until you find yourself in a position where you can do nothing but depend on God, you may never be able to develop such a strong faith. It's a faith that says, God, even when everything goes wrong, even when I don't understand how you're working things out, even when it seems impossible, you have never let me down, and I know that you will continue to keep your promises to me. Friends, that's the kind of faith that will sustain you and will lead you to obey God completely.